Well, then we can just start summing up the diplomatic law. I know that you're interested in this branch of international law because most of my students are willing to take the exams for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that's an integral part of the work done in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not specifically for Turkey, but that's the case all around the world. So it doesn't matter where you're coming from. If you're willing to become a diplomat, then this knowledge is necessary for you. What we're going to cover in this class is the basics of diplomatic law, of course. We won't study it in depth in undergraduate level. First of all, what is diplomacy? Why do we need diplomacy?
To settle everything.
Okay, kind of dispute settlement then, what you're saying. It's a political communication in between states, and it is to settle disputes. Good point, actually, that's true. Diplomatic law is one of the most ancient forms of international law. It used to exist from Roman law until today. For instance, you are already knowledgeable about the fact that killing an envoy was always a reason to make war with each other, right? You knew this already. Like immunities that we have in this century. So, diplomacy is a part of international relations, of course, in practice. And diplomacy is necessary because we have said that we're learning international law and international relations, how to live together in peace. We're not teaching you how to make war in the school, right? What you're all the time learning is how to settle disputes and how to cooperate, how to work together, how to share it together, and so on. So diplomacy's aim is to establish cordial relations, friendly relations, amicable relations. And therefore, diplomats represent their own countries in other countries, in foreign countries, for the establishment, for the settlement of disputes in between, by negotiations and so on that you have already studied. Plus, they are there in order to promote friendly relations. That's the basics. Well, when we talk about diplomats, actually, who can represent their own countries? Are you representatives of your countries of origin?
No.
What do you think? No, why no?
Because we don't hold public office.
That's true. We're not civil servants, that's why. Actually, we are citizens of our countries, that's for sure. But representation is something else, and the representation is done through either natural representatives or through diplomats. So the first question is, who are natural representatives? Natural representatives are those officials at home in the country of origin. That can be a president, that can be an emperor, that can be a queen, king, whatever. The head of the state, whatever the political regime in that country is, head of the state is the natural representative of that country. Therefore, when the head of the state is making their foreign visits, what we know is that the head of the state is representing their own country. And representing own country means representing own independence and sovereignty. Therefore, there's very famous, regular sayings that I don't like the president, but my respect is for the office. Of course, because the office represents the sovereignty of that country, the independence of that country, the pride and honor of that country. For that reason, head of the state is the natural representative number one. And this was always the case. This is not something new. This is an ancient rule. This is codified at the moment in certain treaties. However, head of the state was always the natural representative of the state. This was the case for the customary international law. Later, it is also codified into different international treaties. In addition to the head of the state, we can also mention the head of the government. This is the case for parliamentary systems. In parliamentary systems, a cabinet is formed, and the cabinet is led by the head of the government. That can be called the prime minister, but in certain countries, there are also different names for the head of the government. Let's call her the prime minister. The prime minister is the natural representative of their country because the cabinet determines the domestic and foreign policies of that country. And therefore, the prime minister represents that foreign policy, also domestic policies as well. Minister of Foreign Affairs is the number 3 natural representative of their own country. Well, Foreign Office or Minister of Foreign Affairs is the office where foreign policy is implemented. And the leader of that office represents the entire foreign policy of their own country. This is why the Minister of Foreign Affairs is number 3 natural representative. In the cabinet is led by the Prime Minister, we have said, and the cabinet includes Minister of Foreign Affairs, but that's not everything about the cabinet. The cabinet also has a Minister for Health. The cabinet also has a Minister for Labor and Social Rights. Cabinet also includes diverse ministries, depending upon what country that is. Those ministers can also be perceived as natural representatives of their own country, but not in their entire foreign policy. This time, we consider them as representatives of their countries in issues that cover their own issue areas. So, Minister of Health can be representing Turkish health policy in foreign countries, but we wouldn't be seeing her or him putting the signature for trade policies, for instance, or any other international policy. Therefore, other ministers are also representatives or leaders of different public offices as well. However, for the issue areas that they are liable for. So when Minister of Tourism appears as representative of Turkey in World Tourism Organization, this truly makes sense. But Minister of Tourism is not representing Turkey in World Health Organization. So you understand what I mean. Do you have any questions until here? So what we have covered is all about natural representatives in diplomacy. In addition to natural representatives, there are diplomats, the diplomatic agents. Diplomatic agents are civil servants and they're working under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA. They have different career steps. Once you graduate, once you take the exam, of course, never become directly the ambassador. Would be lovely for you, as I say. Well, do you know with which first step you start?
In the Turkish system with 3. kağıt.
Third secretary. True. First of all, a training is necessary for the diplomatic agents. They first start with training, kind of education under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then they start as the third secretary. And then they start climbing up, second secretary, first secretary, and then they take some exams to become the consular, and third consular, second consular, first consular, and then they either become the ambassador or not. It depends. in addition to that, recently you have already seen that in newspapers that people not coming from this career were also appointed as ambassadors. So that's also kind of political decision, how it goes. However, the core point that we have to emphasize at this stage is that all states have their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they train and employ their own diplomats under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here you see the word attaché. Attachés are also diplomats, but this time they're not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they're coming from diverse public institutions. So military attachés are known to you, right? They are the representation of, let's say, Turkish army in different countries by NATO and so on. Or cultural attaché is a person that represents the cultural policies of their own country in corresponding countries. It makes totally much sense if Turkey has a cultural attaché, for instance, in Venice, because of cultural ties necessary and so on. We have two important sources for the diplomatic law. I'll start with the Vienna Convention of '61. This one only covers the diplomatic relations. The other source is the '67 Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. We'll come to that. But this is the most important thing for you. Vienna Convention of '61. Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Well, we call it with its name 61, but it entered into force in 1964, and it is there to emphasize the functions of the diplomatic mission and diplomatic agents. The immunities and privileges of the diplomats are mentioned in that treaty as well. First of all, how do diplomatic relations start? You have already studied this as we were studying the statehood. First, the entities become states. And then this part is totally legal story. And if the right for self-determination is correctly used, then they appear as states and they receive the recognition of their counterparts. Recognition, as you remember, is not a legal act. Recognition is a totally political act. And recognition's aim is starting the diplomatic relations. Do you remember that part? Okay, then diplomatic relations start following the recognition of the state. And according to Vienna Convention, how does that mission start? Is that, first of all, let's talk about the chief of the mission, like the ambassador, because this makes most sense. The ambassador is the representing person of their own country of origin. So Turkish ambassador in Cairo represents Turkish Republic in Cairo. Embassies are always found in the capital city, right? And ambassadors are appointed to embassies. And they are there mostly for political representation, national representation. They are there, according to Vienna Convention, to protect and promote their national interests. But this is not everything about the work of the ambassadors. They're also there to promote friendly relations in between the receiving country and sending country. They are also there to protect and promote the rights of their nationals living in that very receiving country. And how does an ambassador selected and sent is a question. Selection is a domestic part. After the selection, the profile of the prospective ambassador is sent to the counterpart, to the receiving country. And then the receiving country assesses the profile of the ambassador and shares their views with the sending country. They either approve or reject before the ambassador is already sent. This is known as, this is called with the French word agrément, so agreement, but this is how it is called in literature. So first of all, agrément is sought. If the countries agree upon the person who is going to be the ambassador in the receiving country. This step is followed by the arrival of the ambassador in this receiving country, and after the arrival, the ambassador seeks an appointment by the head of the state. And as soon as possible they meet, and when they meet, the ambassador provides their credentials to their counterpart. Credentials, what we mean is actually, before the ambassador leaves the sending country, she is given an envelope by their own head of the state. And when the person arrives in the receiving country, that envelope is given to the receiving country's head of the state. So this is how it works. This is also known as the letter of trust. And have you ever heard that in the news? How is that in Turkish? You know it? That's true. İtimatname or güven mektubu sunmak. So this is how the mission is appointed and it starts. After it starts, who do we come across with? Either we come across there as the chief of the mission with the ambassador. If the ambassador is not the case, sometimes, because of political reasons, we hear states downgrading their diplomatic representation. Then it is possible that we also come across with envoys instead of ambassadors, like ministers, or we can also come across with consuls instead of the ambassador, so one step lower. Or, for instance, at the moment, in the US Embassy in Ankara, we do not come across with an ambassador, but instead, there we see the charge d'affaires. How is the word in Turkish? Try it. You know the word. Maslahat güzar. Oh, very Turkish. Maslahat güzar. Charge d'affaires. So, perhaps you also need some Turkish lessons. Either we see the ambassador or an envoy, a consul, if not then charge d'affaires. All of them can be the head of the mission in the receiving country. In the receiving country, we have said that the ambassadors do their representation. They protect and promote their national interests, and they try to promote friendly relations in between their own country and the receiving country. Now, there's one more important point related to their privileges and immunities. In the beginning of the class, we have said that we are already knowledgeable that since the ancient times, killing, murdering an envoy is a huge assault. This is unacceptable. This was seen as a legitimate casus belli. You're smiling because I know. Well, there was an incident in Turkey recently, and it did not cause any kind of war. Thanks God. That's another story. We'll come to that. We can mention that at the end of the class again, how it has developed, because it has also a very political side. Killing of Russian ambassador in Ankara. That was so unfortunate. Before talking about that, because it has many political aspects to mention, let's talk about the privileges and immunities of the diplomatic staff. And then we can talk about persona non grata. That was last year in one of the exams. Someone has written to me persona non prada. And since then, I'm also skeptical if I'm mentioning the correct word. Persona non grata is an important element. Let's start with immunities. As soon as the diplomatic staff arrives in the receiving country, their immunities start. Immunities cover their person, bodily, physically, their families. Immunities should also be mentioned for the buildings that they reside and work in, and vehicles, plus the diplomatic bag. So first of all, immunities for persons. Let me see if I have it in between my slides. Good. There are diplomatic immunities on person. Diplomatic immunities on person cover that the person, the diplomatic agent, cannot be detained, the person cannot be arrested. So they have jurisdictional immunities. They also have immunities of execution. Their cars are immune. Their family members, their spouses, and their children are also immune. The definition of family can change from country to country. That definition of the receiving country is important, of course. And what we know is that for the majority of the cases, family means spouses and the children. So for most of the cases, the parents or siblings, sisters, brothers, are not included. But there are some exceptions in Africa. And in some other countries as well, actually. This makes those people honorable. These immunities are granted to those people because of the respect for the sending country. And this doesn't mean that, yes, the diplomatic agents can become criminals and nothing would happen to them in the receiving country. This is never the case. First of all, they enjoy those immunities. Secondly, they are liable to respect the laws, rules, and also the traditions and customs of that country. This is what is expected by the receiving country. Well, the questions related to immunities are always about car crashes, accidents, traffic accidents. That's the smallest part. I mean, tell me, what if an ambassador is caught on human trafficking? Because they enjoy privileges. This is the part. I mean, diplomatic agents are granted diplomatic immunities. Those immunities are from jurisdiction, but they're also expected to respect the laws and rules of the receiving country. What if they do not respect? If we're talking about an accident, it's already an accident. And well, they're immune from jurisdiction in the receiving country, but they're never immune in the sending country. So certain jurisdictional cases can be possible for them in their sending countries. In the receiving country, they're immune. And if it's not an accident, if it's something done on purpose, like a murder, then what would happen? Then we start talking about persona non gratas. Persona non grata is unwelcomed person, someone who is not accepted, who is not approved anymore. The person is not acceptable anymore. The person is not welcome anymore. And as soon as someone is called as persona non grata, the person must leave the country as soon as possible. So they don't have time to sell their belongings and have their farewell parties and look for a cheap plane ticket for next month. It is not the case. If the person becomes persona non grata, then the person must book a flight as soon as possible, must be leaving in a couple of days, latest. So, and the person will never be working in that country anymore. And for most of the cases, they also never enter as tourists as well, back again. So those privileges and immunities, they are protecting the pride of the sending country. This is a respect for the sending country. And this does not make those people immune from any kind of criminal jurisdiction. If they become criminals or if they become disrespectful of the culture, tradition of that country, if they are offensive against the receiving country, then they can be called persona non grata. And once they're called persona non grata, the receiving country is not expected to give any kind of reasons. They don't need to tell why the person, the diplomatic agent, is called persona non grata. As for the privileges, we have spoken about immunities. You know about immunities. As for privileges, what we mean is taxes and customs. So, diplomatic agents are enjoying their privileges in terms of taxes in the receiving country and customs in the receiving country. As for the immunities, back again. Immunities also cover the property. So, there's the embassy building, the consular building, plus there are also residences. And for the ambassador, the working place and the residence, both of them are immune places. Actually, recently we have seen a case in Turkey. Saudi Arabian consul in Istanbul. A murder has happened there. And if you remember, Turkish police is not allowed to enter, is not allowed to perform any kind of search there, and so on. So what we know is that Turkish police has already done that, right? They have entered and they have searched. How could that be possible?
Permission.
Who said that?
As far as I remember, permissions were taken from Saudi Arabia, and then Turkish police is allowed to enter the.
And let me ask then, why did Saudi Arabia give permit for such a search?
Because the other way around will show that in that time they were consistently saying that they are not responsible from death of Cemal Khashoggi, and if they didn't allow, then it will explicitly show that there is something happened inside. So I think in that time they were trying to prove the opposite. So that's why.
Any other explanations?
For sake of the investigation, more time passes, more details and more evidences are lost, and I agree with her.
Saudi Arabia has permitted Turkish police in order to facilitate then the investigation. What else? Yes, please.
Perhaps there could have been an international inquiry at the UN, so maybe Saudi Arabia could avoid that.
There was a huge international pressure over Saudi Arabia. And that's why Saudi Arabia has permitted Turkish police to enter. And the permission was not given so easily. In the very beginning, the first permission, at least what I have read in the newspapers, was that police can enter, but they are not allowed to touch anything. They can only look with bare eyes. That's it. And later, they have expanded the permit, saying that, okay, they can enter with the purple light to see if any blood is remaining on the walls. And then taking samples was the question. If any samples can be taken from the walls, from the floor, from the garden and so on, that was a huge question. And at the end, if you remember, Turkish police entered there and remained there all night long until the next day. And they have searched the building and taken certain samples, but the permission was just limited to the building and certain portion of the garden. Turkish police was not permitted to touch the water wells, plus Turkish police was not allowed to search the car. So the entire building, embassy building, residents, and their vehicles, they are also completely under diplomatic immunities. In the Khashoggi case, we have seen that immunity was partially removed because of international political pressure. And that permission was not unlimited, that permission was only limited to certain areas, certain buildings, certain parts. And as I told you, the cars were still untouchable, water well was still untouchable. In addition to property, perhaps it's necessary to mention the diplomatic bag. Diplomatic bag, when you see it, you understand that it is not the diplomatic bag, of course. So diplomatic bag is not any bag that you can never know what the person is carrying. The person is already unsearchable, but you know, when you enter the airport, then you're leaving your bags for X-rays and so on. For certain reasons, there can be the diplomatic bag. It is either registered in beforehand or notices are sent in beforehand. Certain patches are stuck on the bag and so on, showing that the bag is the diplomatic bag. It cannot be searched. Then this is also covered under certain immunities. I don't know if you have ever met something like that. It is not quite popular at the moment, but a couple of years ago, that was the case. If the bag is a diplomatic bag and if it contains a lot of valuable papers and other stuff in that, then the bag was handcuffed to the agent, diplomatic agent. Perhaps you have seen such people on the airports a couple of years ago. I tell you, it's not the popular method at the moment, but that was the case a few years ago. So the bag was chained on the ankles of the diplomatic agent. Do you have any questions until here about the immunities, privileges? Yes?
Can we talk about tax privileges a little bit wider?
Tax privileges, okay. For instance, when you buy a car in Turkey, it costs too much, a typical Volkswagen. And if you're buying the very same car in Germany, you know that it costs much less. Yes? Why is that so? Plus, that's true, plus taxes. If you were not paying those taxes, the car you're buying would probably be much cheaper, right? Or you will not be paying for that taxes if you're the foreigner in this country. This is taxation privilege then, in the most rough sense, all right? Or if you're interested, you can see such things in Sahibinden.com and so on, and Facebook and so on. If you're looking for cars sold from foreigner for foreigner, you'll see a dramatic difference in between the cars that you buy and sell and the foreigners buy and sell. The difference is because of the taxation privileges. All right? So does that make sense to you then?
Yeah, it's a basic concept.
True. All right. Yes, please.
I don't understand who put down persona non grata, who
The receiving state. Persona non grata is, first of all, diplomatic agent is sent and the receiving country accepts it in beforehand. The person starts working, but if the person becomes suddenly an unacceptable person for the receiving state, then the authorities of the receiving state calls the diplomatic agent of the foreign country the persona non grata. And we never expect the receiving state giving any reasons for their decision. They don't need to. If they wish, they can, of course. But for most of the cases, that's it. They don't name what the cause is, and they simply call the person persona non grata, and the person must leave as soon as possible, and the person becomes unwanted person in that country. This is what it means. Did I see someone else raising their hands? Then I can just continue the consular relations. Yes, yes, yes, yes, please.
He said when the ambassador is honored, this family is also honored. So if the person is persona non grata, does that also happen to his family?
Yes, they live all together. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Hocam, why all these treaties are signed in Vienna? Is there a specific reason for that? Because whenever it's something political or diplomatic, it's always Vienna.
Almost, that's true. It's Vienna, the center for, especially for those treaties related to diplomacies are coming from Vienna, that's true, but that's not a rule.
Yeah.
Okay. And the resulting thing is that there were a series of conferences, of course, in Vienna. That's why they have continued like that. All the agreements were also signed over there as a result of the conferences.
Yeah, but I would expect them to happen in London, as Britain was the hegemon for those centers.
And we never see such treaties named after London, right?
Yes.
That's true. We don't come across with that. You tell me now, what's the difference in between embassy and the consulate? Yes, Liaison.
Yes, council, like embassy in the capital cities, councils can be not in capital. They are not in capital cities. They may be in more than one state in the country.
And how about their functions?
I think kind of same. I did internship in the Consul General in Zurich.
Okay.
But, they were doing almost the same thing. Just the ambassador is more authorized than the consulate.
Okay.
But they I asked exactly the same question and they explained like that.
Let's see. Who wants to? Sinan, let's start
There's
with you.
one embassy in a country, but there are multiple consulates which have multiple jobs. Like embassy just represents a country and has the ambassador, but consulates have many jobs, such as especially in visa when you want to when ordinary people want to travel to that country.
They issue visas. This is one point.
So they would go to in Istanbul, in Izmir, and in other little cities. They may have consulates where they can get their visas issued.
Okay, they issue visas. This is one function. What else?
So if you're a citizen of another country and you live in a different country, you cannot basically mind everything that you want in the consulates. If you go to consulate, they basically send you to embassies.
Okay, complaints. But how about the functions? Do you have something to add?
As in the example of visa, I think consulates usually deal with natural and real persons' problems, let's say roughly, or not only problems but issues for the sending country. I mean, they are dealing with mostly the issues of foreigners regarding the sending country, and visa is one prominent example, but there can be any other problems, just like in the example of Cemal Kaşıkçı visiting the
Why was he visiting the
for
consulate?
the wedding issue, for getting a paper for some sort of, yeah.
That's true, for marriage reasons. But do you have something to add?
They would function as the, for instance, what domestic agencies do here in Turkey.
Kaymakamlık.
Well, not
Okay.
that, but for instance, marriage is a case like that. They would issue marriages for Turkish citizens.
That's true. Well, you have mentioned visas, and you have mentioned marriages and so on.
And passport and IDs are also the same.
Yes, that's also true. If you lose your passport or if you need to extend your passport, then you're supposed to, and if you're not in your own country of origin, then you're supposed to visit the consulate, right? Or imagine you're a student in somewhere in Italy, for instance, in Amsterdam.
I had to launder my passport.
Uh-huh.
They sent me to the embassy. They didn't. I went to consulate, and they said you have to go to embassy of your own country. So.
All right.
Maybe that's the working of them, so that.
We can talk about it then later. Let's see.
Normally the opposite, for example, yeah, Dar es Salaam consulate of Turkey always issued the passports if people lose their passports, but the embassy in Dodoma, like embassies in Dodoma.
Well, embassies also have consulates in them actually, and they issue visas. For instance, most of you are Turkish citizens, and when you want to go abroad, first you visit the embassies here, but the consulate part for your visas, and you're tired of that, as I see. Okay, Puyi. The thing is that consulates are there, the embassies are there for most of the time for their political correspondence. And consulates are there, of course they continue with their political correspondence, plus they take care of their nationals living in the receiving country. So you become a student somewhere in, like, let's say Rotterdam. And then you're a male student and you have to fulfill your military service in Turkey. But you have to show that you're still a student. How do you do so? You do it through your consulate. Or imagine you have an apartment here in Turkey, but you're abroad, and you want to make your sister, for instance, liable for whatever you can do for your apartment. So you need a notary. Your consulate can be your notary under such conditions. Kaşıkçı was in Istanbul consulate because he was getting married. Or there are numerous Turkish citizens living in Germany, right? They get married and they need double divorce when they go for divorce. A German divorce plus Turkish divorce. Therefore, they initiate their marriage and divorce applications through their consulates all around Germany. They don't need to go to Berlin for such things. So, in the consulates, Turkish nationals mainly find their correspondence. Not only, well, nationals, but not only those ones that are living there. Imagine you're being a businessman and you need trade counterpart somewhere in, let's say, Bremen. Then you get in touch with the consulate in Bremen and they facilitate your trade relations, for instance. That's also one thing. Or if you're a German living in Bremen and looking for a visa for Turkey, well, of course, you don't need it, but anyway, then visa is issued by the consulate. So now you have a clear picture what an embassy does and what consulate does. I guess it makes more sense. Consulates deal with their own citizens living in the receiving country. They work as a notary, for instance. They work also as representative of their own sending country. They are there in order to protect the interests of their own country and their own citizens as well, and so on. So they issue passports, they issue visas, they extend passports, they postpone their military service, but not for you, except for you.
Azerbaijan consulate work from again.
For you. All right, and in the consulate, who is the chief of the mission?
The consul general.
The consul general, of course, that's true. But this is not the only person that you meet in a consulate or in the embassy. You don't only meet with the ambassador. There are many other diplomatic agents in different categories. And nationals of the receiving country can also be working there as technical staff for most of the case. I'm sure you have already seen many vacancies in Ankara calling for Turkish nationals, right? So it's also possible, but there is a difference. The nationals of the receiving country do not enjoy diplomatic immunities and privileges. They don't become diplomats. They become the service staff, technical staff, but they never become diplomats of that country. Diplomats are their own citizens, their own nationals. That's how it works. Do you have any questions until here? Did I confuse you? Then I guess we can continue next week, Monday. I stop here. Did I hand you the attendance in? It's there. Rica edeceğim.